Hello and welcome to the Whistling Podcast. My name is Dirk McFriendly and I'm coming to you from Xi'an, China in Shanxi Province. Why am I coming to you from the People's Republic of China? Well, that's another story and we may get into that at a later time. This is the Aboriginal, inaugural, initial, leading cardinal primary, original opening podcast of this series. To be clear at the beginning, I want to make sure you know that this is not a podcast about sports. When I was searching for other whistling podcasts, all I found were sports podcasts referencing a referee's whistle. To be even clearer, here is the dictionary definition of whistling. Definition 1, a verb, to emit a clear high-pitched sound by forcing breath through a small hole between one's lips or teeth. An example sentence is, the audience cheered and whistled. So this definition isn't too precise, as we'll find out in later episodes. There are actually 4, maybe more ways of whistling using your mouth, but we'll get into that at the appropriate time. There is a second definition, to wish for or expect something in vain. And this is a more literary definition, and an example sentence is, you can go home and whistle for your wages. In future podcasts, we may talk about how the word whistling is used in other ways in the English language in various phrases. So you may know of dog whistle or dog whistle politics, the wolf whistle, to blow the whistle on someone, a whistle blower, whistle down the wind, wet your whistle, whistle stop tour, clean as a whistle,
freshened, clean as a whistle,
whistling Dixie, whistling in the dark, whistle pig, whistle up, whistle register. So, having said all that, I realize I may have made an error. Where in modern society do you see or hear whistling more than at sporting events? In a later podcast, we may discuss mechanical whistles, so sports may come into this after all. I have a few questions I want to ask, and there's probably no real answer to these. The first question is, what percentage of the population can whistle? I tried to search on the web for this statistic, but it seems that this study has never been done. There has never been a census question, as far as I know. Can you whistle? There is a Healthline article that says there are no scientific polls on the number of people who can't whistle. However, in an informal internet poll, 67% of respondents indicated they can't whistle at all or not well. Only 13% considered themselves excellent whistlers. There is also a YouTube video I found called 100 People Try to Whistle by Cut Keep It 100, and the results did not seem to be favorable.
Can you whistle?
No, I can't.
We may never know the answer of what percentage of people in the world can whistle, but whistling is not at all rare. I hear whistling on the streets every day. Almost every time I go into a grocery store, I hear some whistling in a jingle or a new pop song. So it's safe to say the art of whistling is not dead. I would eventually like to hear how other people learned how to whistle. In my case, I really don't remember the first time I ever whistled. I remember my mother could whistle to call the dogs home. My father knew the trick of putting a blade of grass between 2 fingers and whistling. I had a grandfather who could whittle twigs to make whistles, and there must have been primary school friends who taught me a thing or two. I remember a lot of old men being able to whistle, either at church or at school, especially janitors. It seemed like janitors were great whistlers for some reason. I'm sure that TV shows like The Andy Griffith Show and others, and also hearing the Harlem Globetrotters theme and seeing Disney movies must have had some kind of influence on me. So about the time I was in junior high school, I had a bunch of 45 records that my grandmother had given me, and I remember being pretty good at whistling the Andy Griffith Show theme and also the Colonel Bogey March, or theme from the Bridge Over the River Kwai. And in high school, I remember playing the video game Galaga a lot and being able to imitate the trilling sound from that video game. I also learned how to create car sirens and car alarm sounds. In high school, I was in the jazz band, and I got into listening to jazz albums and whistling along to them, especially whistling along to saxophone or clarinet solos, and it's pretty much been the same throughout the rest of my life. I am not a professional whistler, although I have whistled on a few recordings, but nothing too big or popular. And that is my story of whistling. So, what topics will I be trying to cover in this podcast? One of the bigger subjects I want to get into is the history of whistling. Even though it seems pretty intuitive that humans have been whistling for a long time, thousands and thousands of years, the evidence is pretty scarce before the modern era. Of course, before recording, there really is no evidence except for literary evidence of whistling. There are some allusions in the Bible and other ancient books about whistling, but we're not quite sure what they mean by whistling. There is one book about the history of whistling called A Brief History of Whistling, written by John Lucas and Alan Chatburn. I'll be reading and discussing that book. Other than that, as far as I know, there's only a few scholarly articles written about the history of whistling, and it seems to be that everyone references those when they're doing any work on the history of whistling. I want to talk about the recorded history of whistling. As you may know, the phonograph was invented by Thomas Edison in 1877, and since then we've had recordings of whistling. I think there's probably about 140 years of recordings of whistling. And as a matter of fact, we'll talk about one of the early pop stars who was famous for his whistling. I'd like to talk about individual artists. Some of my favorites are Bing Crosby, Al Jolson, Roger Whittaker, Toots Thielemans, Ron McRobbie, and Fred Neil. We'll be talking about the songs we all know. If I mention the song Dock of the Bay, what comes to mind? How about Walk Like an Egyptian, Colonel Bogey March, Blow My Whistle by Florida, etc., etc. Even though this video is 8 years old, I just realized on YouTube there is a video called The History of Whistling. I hope it doesn't make this podcast obsolete or superfluous. So there's plenty to talk about as far as whistling in rock and pop recordings. I'd like to talk to real whistlers in the real world, especially professional whistlers. I hope that they'll want to talk to me. And this is not an exclusionary podcast. I will talk to people who can't whistle, whether they hate whistling or they find that they can't whistle and would like to learn. We may talk about how to learn how to whistle. There are books on how to whistle, and there are YouTube videos on how to whistle. I hope that everyone who wants to whistle can, and as far as I know, there is not any outright suppression of whistling in the world, but we may find that there is, and I will do all I can to fight that oppression, wherever it may be. We'll talk about superstitions about whistling. There are plenty of web articles about whistling, and I will respond to those when I find them. We'll talk about the International Whistlers Convention, which happens once a year. Hopefully we'll talk to professional whistlers and maybe talk to participants and even winners of that competition. And that's just a short list of the things I'd like to cover. Hopefully the amount of recorded whistling and the amount of information on whistling will be enough to last for a long time. So I'm looking forward to getting started. I think my first topic will be the history of whistling. This is just the introductory podcast. Ciao.